All right, here's our second video for sample bias. Or sorry, I read ahead. Here's our second video for the guidelines of analyzing a statistical study, whether we should believe it or not. We have 6 more guidelines to cover, okay? The first one for this video is looking for sample bias, okay? We talked about sample bias a few sections ago, but in this case, we want to identify if there is anything wrong with the sample. And this refers to that participation and selection bias that we talked about at the beginning of this section. So let's see if we can identify the parts of that here, okay? So Literary Digest, popular magazine of the 1930s, was notorious for predicting the winner of presidential elections accurately. So this magazine was, for the longest time, they were able to say, hey, this is who's going to win. And that person that they predicted would actually win. Okay. The process they follow is that they randomly choose a sample of 10 million people from lists such as, telephone lists and country club memberships, among other lists. What they would do is they mail a ballot to each of these 10 million people, and then in return, they received about 2.4 million responses. Okay. So how can we see the selection and the participation here? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about both the selection bias and the participation bias. So in terms of selection, what do you think is the biggest issue here? Oh, what is it doing? Sorry about that. Okay, well, I fixed that. Think to yourself, where are you seeing selection bias here? Okay, well, remember, selection bias has to do with choosing a sample that is not representative of the population. Okay, so they chose 10 million people from telephone lists and country club memberships. Do you think every single American back in the 1930s either owned a telephone or was part of a country club? Absolutely not, right? So that's the issue. Sample not representative. Ooh, representative of all Americans. Okay. Not every single American had a telephone and not every single American had a country club membership. So whatever result they get from these ballots, they cannot extrapolate. That's when we go ahead and extend the results to the population. We extrapolate the results to the population. That is not an okay thing to do because our sample is not representative. Okay. And I said earlier that this is also participation bias. Where do you see participation here? Well, when you get this ballot, are you required to respond to it? No. This is a magazine. No one's knocking down people's doors, forcing them to respond. And then on top of that, whenever you get a survey, whenever you get a ballot, like if someone sends you a survey to, fill out, when is the time that you're going to actually fill it out? It's when you feel passionately about it, right? If I went to I mean, you get it, right? If you don't feel passionately about psychology or whatever, you're not going to fill out a survey if someone gives it to you, unless like you're a really nice person, right? Or you weren't interested, you had nothing better to do. But if it's something that you feel passionate about, of course you're going to want to voice your opinion, right? So in this case, only those passionate about the presidential election would fill this out. Okay, so that's where our participation bias comes from. That's the issue with participation bias at the end of the day. It's not just that, one of the things is that the people who provide responses might not reflect the initial sample you gathered, but it's also the fact that only the people that are passionate about whatever your survey is are going to, are going to fill it out. Okay. So just keep that in mind whenever you see studies that involve survey questions. You want to analyze who is in the sample and whether or not you have these instances of selection and participation bias. All right, guideline number 4. We're going to look at how variables are defined and measured, okay? So remember, variables are the things that we look at in the study. You know, what is it that they're measuring in a study, you know, in that smoking study with the Surgeon General, the variable was smoking rate. How often do Americans smoke? In that literary digest, the variable was you know, yes or no, or sorry, not yes or no, the opinion of the people as to who they thought was going to win the presidential election. Okay, so in this one, we have a survey in USA Today was given to the wealthiest 1% of Americans. It asked them how much they would pay for things like true love, great intellect, talent, eternal youth, etc. So our variables in this case, our variables in this case are the things like true love, great intellect, and then the others, right, etc. Well, look at all 4 of these words and, well, not words, all 4 of these variables and tell me if you can exactly pinpoint a definition for this stuff. And then even if you could, are you confident that your definition of, say, true love is going to be the same definition as like your classmate or as your best friend or as someone in your family? Probably not, right? Someone might think true love is like unconditional love. Someone else might think it's, you know, um, whatever, right? Great intellect might be like someone has a PhD, and to someone else, it might be just a master's degree. Talent could be so many different things, right? So whenever people give variables like these, where it's kind of non-concrete, they're more like abstract variables. You have to watch out and see that they define them correctly. Even a variable such as amount of exercise can be pretty dangerous because what does this person qualify as exercise, right? If someone were to say that this is what they were studying, then they would need to tell us exactly what counts as exercise. Are they just counting the stuff that you would do at the gym? Are they counting, you know, people who would walk to school? Does that count as exercise? Cleaning around the house, does that count as exercise? So make sure variables are defined precisely and completely. All right, make sure that no one is trying to beat around the bush or trying to kind of wiggle their way out of defining something, because that is also a pretty strong indicator that the study might not be credible. Speaking of variables, our next guideline is to look for any possible confounding variables. We talked about confounding variables in section 1.3. And remember, confounding variables are variables that could potentially cause the effect you're looking for, the thing that you want to conclude stuff about, okay? So let's look at this study or this example really quick. A study seeks to determine whether radon gas causes lung cancer. It does this by comparing lung cancer rates in Colorado, where radon gas is common, to lung cancer rates in Hong Kong, where there is less radon gas. The study took only radon gas into account and found that there was no significant difference in the lung cancer rates. All right, so all they analyzed to find the differences in lung cancer rates in Colorado and Hong Kong was the radon gas. Can you think of another activity that, you know, people might do that could contribute to, you know, an increase or a decrease of lung cancer rates? This study legitimately only considered radon gas when smoking is kind of another lead cause in lung cancer. Smoking in this study is the biggest confounding variable that they could have just, that they absolutely just did not control for. Okay, and And we talked about how dangerous confounding variables are in 1.3. This is how dangerous they could be. Because this study just said, oh, radon gas is not a big deal. But they didn't realize that smoking in Colorado is significantly less than smoking in Hong Kong. So even though radon is like non-existent in Hong Kong, the smoking in Hong Kong is way more prevalent than it is in Colorado. Okay, so that study kind of messed up big time. They said that radon gas doesn't do anything. However, we forgot to take into account how many people smoke in each of those places. All right, so really when you're looking for confounding variables, you have to ask yourself the question, is there anything that could lead to the desired conclusion that was not already mentioned or controlled. Okay. So if you're going to be a really good researcher, you need to control the confounding variables. If you're going to be lazy, then you at least need to mention, they're smoking, but we didn't look into it. Because then in that case, you're telling your audience, hey, my study kind of sucks because I didn't control this variable, right? So researchers absolutely need to look into these kinds of variables. And it kind of, another example is like dieting. You know, if someone were just looking at, or sorry, not dieting, weight loss. If someone were just considering dieting, but the participants are also exercising, but they didn't take that into account and they made conclusions about the diet, then that is also a severe flaw. Okay, so you have to make sure that these studies are accounting for these extra potential confounding variables. All right, we'll go ahead and stop this video here, and in our last video, we'll cover guidelines 6, 7, and 8.